Hello and welcome to this review of my IBM P70 keyboard, an IBM keyboard made by Alps Electric. Indeed, quite a combination. The P70 was a so-called luggable computer that was introduced in 1987. It was fairly slim for the time and quite light, only 9 kilograms, and it came with an adjustable plasma screen and a fold-out keyboard that formed one of the side panels when not in use. Now, of course, IBM made most of their keyboards for their computers themselves. At that time, their standard issue keyboard was the venerable Model M. Now, the Model M is an extremely well-built keyboard with a very nice key feel, but it's unfortunately also very heavy, 2 kilos or more, and it's really big, neither of which is a particularly practical trait on a luggable computer, which, of course, you want to keep as small and light as possible. So they needed something quite radically different, but instead of designing one themselves and building all kinds of tooling for it, they contracted Alps Electric in Japan to design one for them, which they had done several times before, by the way. I got this particular one for £27.5 from someone in the UK, and I had it shipped to me without the computer attached, which would have cost a fortune, but as a loose board it was very cheap to ship. It comes with a non-standard connector on the keyboard side and plugs straight into the motherboard on the other side. But I knew the system was PS2 based, so I thought I could probably get it to work. So I chopped the end off the keyboard cable, stripped the wires, and connected them to the wires of a similarly stripped PS2 cable using the pinouts that you can find online. Then I sealed the wires, stuck it in this box from Maplin, and plugged it in, and voila, working P70 keyboard. The addition of a full-length PS2 cable is quite useful as well, because the cable that comes with it is very short because it only had to reach a tiny bit into the fold-out design. There is just one oddity: when you press any lock key, it completely dies and it will not work again until you restart the computer. So normally I use it without the lock key caps on to remind me not to use them. The fact that it's fold out does mean that it's normally protected from dust and dirt though, and this one was pretty clean in fact, just a little amount of light dust which was easy to blow out. Now the construction of this feels quite flimsy. The case is all plastic, it doesn't even have a mounting plate, the switches are soldered directly into the PCB, and there is a positively alarming amount of flex in the case. It really reminds me of the Model M2, by the way, which also had all of these weaknesses, and which you could also flex to a ridiculous degree. Of course, the reason they made it like this is to keep the weight down, which is quite understandable. And in fact, they succeeded quite well, because it's only a little over half the weight of a Model M. It's held together by a plethora of plastic clips hidden all over the case, and you have to loosen them in a specific order as well, and I've tried opening it, but fuck me, does this thing not want to be meddled with. There is a seriously cool silver on grey IBM PS2 badge with raised lettering on the back. But there's no model stickers or anything on the back because this was a side panel of the computer. Instead, the stickers are all inside this little ridge here. One shows all kinds of part and serial numbers, and the other one, on the other side, shows the IBM logo, that it was made in Japan, and what I presume is a manufacture date in 1989. This thing that the stickers are located in was originally what kept it retained to the computer. And that's how it flips out. But if you fold it down, like that, you can use that as a keyboard foot, and it works really well. Now, you might have noticed this already, but this is actually quite a flat keyboard, especially for something this old. And if you don't fold out the foot, it lies really, really low on your desktop. See? There's some F-key shortcut stickers for a Lotus program at the top. I don't think it came with it by default, but it looks nice in retro. And there is a pronounced ridge at the top as well that you can use as a pencil tray. In order to get a nice low-profile keyboard, they went with Alps plate spring switches, which have a tiny Alps logo on the top half of the housing. Hopefully you can see that. Now, plate spring might sound like it's some variation of buckling springs, but it's not. Although Alps did make their own form of buckling spring switches. Check out last week's video on my Alps SM101 if you'll want to see one of those. These plate spring switches are completely different though, and if anything they're closer to IBM's earlier beam spring design, although that one was capacitive, whereas this one isn't. The plate spring in this is quite similar to those vacuum test systems you get in food jars nowadays. You know, that little circle thing here that pops up if the vacuum in the jar has been broken? Well, the plate springs are essentially exactly that. When you press it, you'll see it inverts at some point. And that's exactly how these switches work. To give it full travel and a less harsh key feel, they stuck a coil spring on top of the plate spring, so that the slider doesn't work directly on the plate. And below this is essentially a switch plate, much like that of typical Alps switches, where two contacts are pressed together when you push it. Now, last week's Alps buckling springs are found to be more tactile than IBM's buckling springs, and not a bad switch overall, but I still didn't like them as much as IBM's design. These ones, though, feel excellent, very smooth and with a satisfying tactility and a really cool sound as well. Particularly on the way back, the plate springs make a really unique noise as they spring back into place. It's a very distinctive, interesting noise that I like a lot personally. I should note that they don't feel at all like the more typical Alps SKCM switches. One thing that's very typical of those switches is that after the tactile bump there's almost no resistance, and it's very easy to bottom out after that unless you type very lightly. On the other hand, these still have a bit of springiness in them after the bump. It's nowhere near as pronounced as something like Cherry MX Clear, which actively resist you trying to bottom them out, but it's definitely got some resistance left. Overall, they're very smooth and very well balanced, which is probably the best word I can give it, and they give lots of tactile and clicky feedback. I think they're excellent personally. And then we move on to the matter of keycaps. Now, IBM's keyboards always came with thick PBT keycaps, and Alps made some pretty thick PBT keycaps as well, like this one. But in the case of the P70, possibly to save weight, they made these skin-thin caps that are almost like a PBT foil on top of the sliders. They're possibly the thinnest keycaps I've seen so far. You can quite easily squeeze them like this. They still came with high-quality dye-sublimed lettering though, and it looks exceptionally thick and bold. Much thicker than that on the Model M even. They look pretty nice, and just like on Model M's of that time, the numpad caps are double die sub with brown secondary legends. So, although the caps might prove to be a bit vulnerable to shattering if you accidentally drop the keyboard, they still look pretty good at least. The spacebar is ABS though, as PBT isn't easy to make spacebars out of, and as you can see it's quite obviously yellowed much more than the PBT caps, which remain white. Overall, I really like this thing. It might feel flimsy, but it looks pretty good, and the switches are a joy to use. It's even relatively compact for full-size keyboards. The top bezel is a little bit deep, but lengthwise it's pretty much the same size as modern keyboards. So I'm really happy with it, and I'd happily recommend it to anyone that likes clicky switches. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.